Okay, let's get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Kai Unkrot. I'm a senior program manager in the SQL Server Analysis Services team. And one area of specialization for me is self-service BI, primarily with focus on Power Pivot related technologies. In this session, I would like to talk about self-service BI governance as a tool to make a business run more efficiently, to turn a business into a data-driven organization. As such, I'd like to first go through an overview of what BI governance really is all about when it comes to self-service BI governance specifically. And then talk about some of the key elements within a reference architecture that has an influence on how to govern a self-service BI environment. And then talk a little bit about the differentiation between self-service BI and managed self-service BI, what the difference really is and what it means for an organization. And then also talk a bit about what self-service BI can do for an enterprise organization that also has corporate BI solutions. What this session is not about, it is not about telling you how to do self-service BI governance. That's impossible for me to do because every organization is different. Every organization has their own way of governing their users, and there is no one-size-fits-all. What I'm trying to do in this session is I'd like to give you the most important key milestones that a self-service BI governance effort should try to reach. And if you reach these milestones successfully, then you have a good chance that a governance effort can succeed. How you reach these milestones, that is up to you. There are, of course, tools and resources available to you. On the internet, there are governance toolkits available from Microsoft for data governance, for example, that can be applied in similar ways to self-service BI governance. Self-service BI governance really is a relatively new field. Some argue that it doesn't actually exist as a separate discipline. But it is important to get a handle on it. And why is this important? It is important to take advantage of self-service BI as a key tool to make information workers, office workers more effective and efficient. But at the same time, it is also about maintaining control and oversight in the enterprise. Why is this important? Without control and oversight, self-service BI looks a little bit like this. Very confusing field of data sources and tools. Self-service implies that every user can essentially build their own tools, share them with others. And if there is no oversight and if there is no control, then organizations frequently run into issues that can well be summarized under the term of spread marks, and spreadsheets are evil. Some organizations indeed go so far as to forbid the use of self-service BI tools for these reasons. And then, of course, the organization misses out on the latest and greatest advancements in BI, which are primarily focused on enabling an office worker to work independent of the IT department. Self-service BI, let's talk about this in more concrete forms in a demo. What does it mean when there is no control? What you see here is a simple Excel spreadsheet, a Power Pivot workbook. I created this workbook simply by following the tutorial that is included in the product. If you press F1 in Excel, you reach this. So I created my self-service solution, and I can go in here and analyze the data that was provided to me. That's not what I'm about. What I'm about is to go and find interesting new data sources. Think of me as a power user, and one of the greatest data sources that I could find is amazing data about pink panthers. And here I see the population of pink panthers around the world, and I thought this was an awesome data set that I wanted to integrate into my analysis. Of course, I have Data Explorer, which makes it easy for me to bring this data into my model. All I need is the URL. Now Data Explorer connects to that web page, discovers that it has some tables. There's my pink panther table. Data Explorer already makes it easy for me to, it discovers that it has a header, it discovers that this is an integer. So now I can import this data as a table into my Excel workbook. And in about another moment, I have my table here. Let me just rename this table real quick. Pink Panthers count. And then I can add that to my data model. And I'm ready to analyze data based on this table. To do this, we'll go into Power Pivot real quick. Just a few minor modifications, and I can show you something very interesting. Of course, I was playing with that data before. So let's go in here real quick. What I'm going to do is I need to establish a table relationship between the cities that I already have in my table, in my geography table, and my pink panthers table, which I have here. So I'm establishing this relationship so that my data model knows how to bring this demographics information in. And another step, real quick, is to add a new column to my geography. Oops. So that I have this count right there with my cities. I'll rename that column. The reason you don't see any data is because not every city has a pink panther apparently, but I can show you if I filter this column, then you'll see it. See. I'll take the blanks out for a moment. And there's some data. So we have the pink panthers in. Now let's create a new chart, and I can show you something interesting in that data. All right. Let's insert a pivot chart. Oops. No. I'm sorry. Let's create a new worksheet first. And now insert that pivot chart. I'm connecting this chart to my data model. And now we're ready to see a few things. We'll analyze by city. We'll go and take the pink panthers count. Come on. That's not so interesting yet. And then we'll look at the sales quantity to find out what products pink panthers are buying. Okay. Now this shows me the data over the entire world, but it's a bit much, so let's go and create some slicers. We're almost done with that modeling here. I need to go to the product category as an important field for me. I also need the color of the product. And then some country information, and then we're done. I'm not going to arrange it too much. Prettiness is not important, the facts are important. And the fact is that pink punters buy a lot of pink cell phones. How do I find this out? When you look at it, let's say, for example, the United Kingdom, you can see the relationship between the data. Wherever there is a high sale in pink cell phones, there is a high population of pink panthers. I can see the same pattern in the United States. It's a little bit, there are too many cities here. Let's go for New York, for example. The same thing is true. This is awesome, isn't it? Now I'm getting really excited as a power user. I can also calculate out my market potential. Let's do that real quick. My boss, by the way, sees this and he is already excited. Let's add a measure to the fact sales table. And this is a very simple formula. We'll sum up the pink panthers we have in a geography table, subtract the sales quantity from the facts table, and then divide that by the sum of our sales panthers. All right, let's see if that formula is okay. Yep. Great. Now put this on a world map. I hope that was just a temporary thing. Let's put this on a world map where we can see per location what the potential is for us to sell more pink cell phones to pink panthers. Where is it? Market potential, there it is. I'll turn this into a map. Make this nice and big. Now we just need to add the city. And then add a few filters for our product category and color. Color name should be pink. And the product category should be just cell phones. And I also want to filter this based on, it's still a little cluttered. So let's say we don't want to focus on everything. Let's say we want to focus on the areas where my market potential is roughly larger than 50%. That means locations where I still have a lot of pink punters that don't have pink cell phones. And I see that I really should focus on Ostkorsch and on Marseille. I don't want to click through too much anymore. I have it uploaded, of course, in my SharePoint site. My boss sees this. He's super excited about it. Now my entire team can see this analysis as well. That already is fantastic enough, but as soon as I have this Power Pivot workbook in a SharePoint environment, I can also build additional solutions based on it. Additional folks from my team get excited. They build additional solutions. And then my BI pros become aware of this solution. Everybody in the sales department is focusing on selling pink cell phones all of a sudden. And they think that is very exciting. And they go about and say, wow, we need to really migrate this tool that the sales team has into a corporate BI solution. So they fire up their BI tool and they take this workbook and convert it very quickly into a tabular database. There it is. Then they publish this tabular database, and now we can even build corporate scorecards and KPIs that show everything, and the organization is super happy. There's my model with all the data in it too. I can also see the models here on my AS instance. And then our business managers go home very proud that they have this fantastic solution that allows them to monitor really the performance of their sales organization for pink cell phones. And then at home, Daddy is bragging about how cool BI is, and then the little daughter says, but Daddy, I thought pink panthers don't exist. And that is what self-service BI really is offering you, a very great opportunity to chase pink panthers. I had another flaw in my sample, and that flaw was when let me show you this real quick. I mean, pink panthers is obvious, but what's perhaps not so obvious was the conclusion I drew from my data. When I show you this, I just decide that pink panthers buy pink cell phones based on just the correlation of some data that might be entirely arbitrary. I didn't do any research. I didn't verify anything. I just said, wow, that must be true. And if nobody challenges this, then it is true. And if you share it, then the next user is already one more step away from the truth. Where does this data actually come from? Well, it comes from this workbook that is shared in my SharePoint environment. If the data lineage is not clear all the way to the data source, then the organization will very likely run into issues with data quality. Bad formulas is another example. If you follow the discussions on the web, you can often find articles where Excel is accused of leading organizations to make wrong decisions. And the proof is that there are bugs in formulas. Yeah, if you show wrong results, and if you have no way to verify that the results are right or wrong, then you can be in trouble. Insecure devices is another big risk for BI. You make everything right, the data is clean, the formulas are right, the results are correct, and then the competition says, thank you for sharing all these great findings. And then we just have the proliferation of unmanaged self-service BI solutions. Give you a real-world example. My wife is a flight attendant for an airline in the Northwest, and their baggage handlers were using an Excel spreadsheet to calculate how the load in an airplane should be distributed. It's important for an airplane to be evenly balanced. And that was a baggage handler that created that solution. And it spread to all airports. And it was a great tool for them until the IT department changed the data source. The SQL Server schema changed. And the workbook broke. And all of a sudden on all airports, there was trouble getting the planes loaded. And the telephones to the IT department started ringing, and the IT department had no clue. They didn't even know that this workbook existed. And that is one of the reasons why IT departments frown when we talk about empowering office users, information workers with great tools that allow them to solve their own problems, because IT is completely now out of the picture, and if we don't bring IT back into the picture, then it can be disastrous later down the road, when these tools that some office worker creates take on a whole different meaning. But we shouldn't outlaw self-service BI. There is a definite value in it. If IT has proven one thing in the last decade, then that it cannot solve all the business problems in an organization. We need to empower the office worker, the information worker, to solve their own problems because they are the ones who understand it best. So how can self-service BI contribute there? First of all, it doesn't take any more half year, or 6 months or a year to build a BI solution. I can do this here on stage in a minute, even though it wasn't really a right way. But I can also get a much higher adoption rate for BI tools when I empower everybody with software that they have readily available. It doesn't require you to deploy Excel on every desktop. If you have SharePoint, you can also view these reports in the browser. The tools should be familiar to the users. Excel is familiar to many information workers, for example. And the IT department should take on an entirely different role than what it was in the past. In the classic BI scenario, you go and you get the requirements and you build the tool and it takes a while and then you go back to the business user with the finished tool just to discover that the business user had actually different ideas or the situation has changed and the tool is not that relevant anymore. But now it is more about enabling the information worker to solve the problems for themselves. So the first objective that I would like to point out when you engage in a self-service BI governance effort is to make clear what the roles are in the organization. Who has the authority to make decisions? That's a very important question for governance because if you don't find the people who have actually the authority to make the decisions, then you don't need to engage in governance because you will fail and you will not be able to establish policies and rules. And so there is this pyramid that I'd like to draw, and the user base has the role and responsibility to be aware of the rules and the policies and that there is such a thing as governance. The BI governance committee has a responsibility to actually spin off working groups to try and solve the problems that an organization faces when it goes into self-service BI. I'll give you just one question. How do you make sure that your users are using approved data sources? No, that depends on the organization and needs to be a working group that figures that out. And then we have the executive management layer that is very important in the governance effort. If the executives aren't buying in, then you don't have a governance effort. It's really, it depends. There's, again, no one-size-fits-all. Sometimes a governance effort can evolve from the bottoms up. Some people just start making sense out of a thing. It gets more visibility, and eventually some executive says, yeah, that's for me. I support this. But most of the time, in an enterprise organization, it comes down from the top, where some exec says, hey, we need something. We need to coordinate this. We need to control this before it mushrooms into something we didn't intend it to be. And that's the second important milestone. Whenever you engage in business governance, make sure that you have a decision maker that has the authority both from the business side and from the IT side. Because the self-service BI is not just about IT, it's about business users. But it's also not just about business, it's also about IT and its capabilities. And that's the next pyramid that I would like to point out in that context. You have multiple systems in an enterprise organization, and every one of them is somewhat different. You have file shares, you have sites, you have mobile devices, you have SharePoint team sites. How do you work with these resources? What are the rules that your users should follow? For example, take mobile devices. They are not very secure. Do you allow your users to store your business critical information on an insecure tablet and then go home with it? there's this dotted line where I think there is a separation between what the IT department deals with primarily and what the users deal with. In many organizations, it is reality that users just show up with insecure devices, whether the IT department wants it or not. They just have to accept it. In the upper corner, of course, the IT department has more control and can establish tighter control. The next, once you have the executives, you also need to win the users. Because if you don't win the users, they are going to help themselves anyway. Classical example, if IT in many organizations had it their way, then office workers wouldn't work with Excel. But they are using Excel because it's the tool that makes them productive. And so it is with rules. If you establish rules that users cannot follow or that are inconvenient, you will see that users will find ways around your rules. So how do you win users? Training is very important. Familiar tools that don't drive them crazy. What do we have to offer in the self-service BI space? We have Excel and Power Pivot and Power View for the ad hoc needs. I want to have an answer about a certain question. I bring in the data, I look at it from multiple different angles, and I'm a happy camper. I have Internet Explorer to visualize this in the browser. I have business analysts and decision makers in the same pyramid. Now, there's what I also consider an information worker in this space is if a manager, for example, hires a consultant to build the Power Pivot workbooks for them, that's still within that scenario, below the dotted line there. And then we have the power users in the IT department that create the tools for them, like the consultant, those work with Power View and Power Pivot just the same. When I publish a Power Pivot workbook to a team, then I'm a power user that enables a team to do certain things more efficiently than before. And the tools here are a little bit different. On the professional side, we have SQL Server data tools, which I briefly showed you when I migrated a workbook to a tabular database. And those are pretty much the tools that we offer in the Microsoft BI space. Of course, there's more when you have third-party solutions. What's the next milestone? Well, look for partners. As I mentioned, self-service BI is not the only governance effort that is going on in an enterprise. And when you have the question, how do you do it? Well, don't reinvent the wheel. Just do what other governance efforts in the organization are already doing. There we have, at the bottom, we have the whole corporate governance discipline where executives should already be engaged. We have IT governance at a broad scale. Then there's also the data governance. I'm sure that most of you probably have, that's a sentence I'm sure you probably have, some data governance efforts going on. BI governance in itself might already be started too. That's getting a little thinner. And then we have self-service BI on top of it. But really, governance is just governance. Establishing policies and communicating those policies to the users. And that's practically the same, no matter what area we focus on. And then it gets more technical. As I said, you need to make your users more powerful, not just in terms of the tools that they're using, but also in terms of what data they can actually use. Let me give you a demo of a non-intuitive data source that we in the SQL organization are very fond of. I go to my data tab. Now I create a new connection from SQL. And then let's look at AdventureWorks. So which information worker will be able to figure out how to analyze AdventureWorks data if the schema is like this with that many tables? If you import them all, you get a very large data model that has very intricate relationships. It's very much an unusable data source for an information worker at this place. So how do you provide the data in a format that is easily accessible to the user? You've seen my simple table with the pink panthers. I would say that is easily consumable for an information worker. Single tables, maybe 2 or 3 tables, but not 200 tables in a highly relational database. Table relationships are usually beyond the capabilities, especially complex table relationships, of what an information worker is able to analyze. OData feeds are a very great way to expose backend data sources to users. Another way is to create data marts where you have a pipeline flowing from, let's say, your ERP system or your customer relationship management system or your support systems into data marts that are specifically designed for a specific analytical purpose. And then you have fewer tables in these data marts and you can connect to them. Another one are reporting services reports. You can expose them as data feeds and consume them. Another possibility is you just create a bunch of Power Pivot workbooks, publish them in SharePoint. Those can also serve as data sources for other analysis. The possibilities are very wide there. And those are the elements that you can use to piece together a data infrastructure that is intuitive for your users. At the bottom, we have all the plain text data files, which are, for example, important in supply chain management environments. We have the web content. It can be as simple as a table, as you've seen. The tools that we have today in self-service BI are definitely capable of consuming these data sources directly. Then we have our relational databases, the classical ones, SQL and Oracle, and the larger ones, Teradata, Parallel Data Warehouse. In the big data space, we also have now Hadoop and HD Insight through the Hive connectivity. And we have our multidimensional data sources. And those are the data providers that provide connectivity to those with our tools. And then it's all about this collaboration mantra. When you have an individual user able to create analysis for himself, that's great. Some of that is just for him personally. I've seen users manage their video collection, for example, with Power Pivot. That's a tool you would probably not share with somebody else. But when it's in a business context, it often makes sense to share information. And that's easiest to upload this workbook to a BI-enabled SharePoint farm. And then you already have a rich environment that provides more than just, what a file share server would offer you. An important aspect in the self-service BI environment is also related to how you provide access to the BI tools that you upload, and this is all governed through SharePoint security and permission sets. But SharePoint is not the only place in the environment where users put their workbooks. So how do you maintain a secure a controlled environment, a managed environment? Depends also where these files will be placed. On local disks and file shares, they will not go away just because you have a SharePoint environment. And we have network shares, which are basically an easy way for users to work with their files. And we have the SharePoint sites, but we also have email. People send their workbooks around. How do you keep track of your spreadsheets when they get sent to the users through an email? There are various technologies to do this. And then we have, of course, the cloud environment now coming in with SkyDrive and Office 365, where users can share their analysis. And all of these places where BI solutions can live need to have a set of governing rules around them. For example, in Office 2013, we have the Inquire add-in now, where you can compare worksheets with each other, where you can see hidden elements and risky elements. We have the audit and control management server that can go through the organization and crawl file shares and SharePoint sites and discover all the SharePoints that you have in this environment. You can see, for example, if a workbook exists 100 times in the organization. It's often the case that one user uses a worksheet or a workbook and copies it, changes it a little bit, and uploads it again under a different name, but actually, the workbook is pretty much the same as another workbook. Or you can see what versions of a workbook exist. You track the history, somebody changes that same workbook again, then you will be able to see in this audit and control management server that there's a new version of this workbook. And you can actually overwrite a newer version. Perhaps there was an unauthorized change that was made. You restore an older version and life is good again. Then we have SharePoint. In SharePoint 2013, you have the e-discovery center in addition to, which allows you for forensic analysis and those elements and aspects to keep track of your enterprise content. E-discovery can also integrate into Exchange mailboxes so that you really get a clearer picture where in the organization your BI solutions live. For example, at Microsoft, there's a rule that prevents us from using SkyDrive to upload internal documents. Right? The rule is one thing, but how do you control that we follow that rule? And that is what these systems on the right allow you to do, to keep track of things without hindering the users to actually do their work. And then we're in the area where we need to identify how we are going to integrate all these systems with each other. BI environments are very complex. Having ownership over a complete self-service BI environment can be overwhelming, especially when you include all the data sources that can be used to build BI solutions. And here we have our reference architecture that can help with that. We have the client tier where we have SharePoint and Power View and Power Pivot and Excel and reports and third-party solutions. I didn't include the mobile devices and the tablets. That's definitely one important area. Then we have the SharePoint environments where we present BI content in web pages. We have the backend systems to this presentation layer, which are primarily analysis services and reporting services. But we also have the integration services layer, especially when it comes to bringing data from enterprise systems into data marts that are more easily consumable by end users. And then, of course, we have the data tier, which is about which data sources are your users supposed to work with. And here we see also the line between corporate and self-service BI, where I think that the SharePoint environment in itself blurs it a little bit because farm administrators are IT people. But the SharePoint environment in itself is actually, well, it depends on the organization, but it can be managed by a business unit independently. A site collection administrator, for example, is not necessarily a farm administrator. And the farm administrator cares more about the services that are published in the farm, where the site collection administrator cares about the content within its site collection. Of course, there are also SharePoint environments where the business unit in itself maintains the entire environment. I mean, overall, I think it is not so important where we draw that line specifically. So what is a self-service BI environment really about? It's about SharePoint and some backends. You have the SQL engine that hosts the content databases. You have the analysis services instance that you need to load data models so that you have something that you can query. And everything else lives inside SharePoint as much as it relates to self-service BI. So we have SharePoint 2013, that's our current version. And Excel Services is our main BI enabling service. because Access Service is the one that actually communicates with Analysis Services to load the Power Pivot data models. And we also have Performance Point services within SharePoint to build dashboards and KPIs. Then we have Analysis Services in SharePoint mode. As I've mentioned, you need to load the models somewhere. And we have reporting services for Power View capabilities as well as for data alerts and these kinds of things. And you need to keep in mind that this technology is driven by SharePoint security and not so much by Analysis Services, for example. It's a common question that BI pros ask a lot. That is, how do you create a Power Pivot workbook that gives different results to different users? Like sales region A, the user should see the sales numbers from that region, and sales region B, that user should see just the sales numbers from the region B, and he shouldn't have the rights to see the other numbers. That cannot be done in a Power Pivot workbook. In Power Pivot, you have no security in Analysis Services. If you have access to the workbook, you have access to the data model, and you can see and access and query all the data. If you want to separate it, you need to create two workbooks and give the users from A permissions on workbook A in SharePoint, and in that way you can ensure that the right data is exposed to the right people. But it doesn't work like in a tabular data model. There you have row-level security. There you can specify, but that's not a self-service BI scenario. That's a corporate BI scenario. SharePoint also gives you the ability to configure workflows. When an Office user uploads a new workbook and shares this with a team, that might be seen as a significant step in the life cycle of a BI solution, and you might want to have an approval process associated with that, where you could look at the analysis, where you can verify that the results are right, where you could check that the pink panthers are indeed existing or not, and send the workbook back. That's just a sample workflow as an illustration here, but SharePoint, of course, gives you all these capabilities. And then there is this aspect of managed. I mentioned it in the beginning. There's self-service BI and there is managed self-service BI. And that is when we bring the IT department back into the picture on the governance level. So IT has now established a data infrastructure that the users find very intuitive. They have fun with the data. They can create the solutions they need. They have a new question. They know where to go. They have catalogs where they can find the information. And then they are really happy with the IT department and they say, thank you. This is great. We don't need you guys for anything else. We're good. But you still have the problem that if something breaks, then all of a sudden IT gets back into the picture, and then IT is pretty much blind unless you have tools in place where you can actually track. What do you need to track? Well, the first thing that would be interesting, I think, would be how many users are using the workbooks or the BI solutions that these office workers create. And then maybe also ask, who in the organization is using these workbooks? I mean, it would be one thing if my peer colleague is using my workbook. It's another thing if Steve Ballmer all of a sudden starts looking at my stuff. It would be good to know. And this information can also help me discover what's really business critical for my organization. Keep in mind, what I showed you in the beginning in this one funny demo, I mean, take away the fact that this was not very useful in analysis, but I had a workbook that can act as a data source for other workbooks. Now other people start building on top of mine, and then one fine day I just decide to delete my workbook. And then it's gone, and all the others break too. That's possible in self-service BI, and nobody prevents me from doing that. But the IT department should have a tool that they can actually look at that and say, wait a minute, there are 20 other users using this workbook. Shouldn't we take care of this workbook ourselves? shouldn't we take this particular workbook and convert it into a tabular database that we maintain on our BI servers properly, and we have backups and everything? And that's what managed allows the IT department to do. And for us, the primary tool out of the box that comes with our BI technologies for SharePoint is the management dashboard. The management dashboard gives you, do I have a demo? Oops. Let me go back here. Yeah. The management dashboard looks like this. It is integrated into SharePoint Central Administration. So basically, here you can, let me go first to the workbook activities. My data is a little old. That still shows you what's going on this system. So I can see how many users my workbooks have, and I can see how many queries these workbooks generate. I can see the size of the workbooks. As a fancy tool here, I can have this fly around. I mean, on the old data here, it's not really that important. I can see data refresh history. I don't have any here, but you could see which workbooks were most recently refreshed, and perhaps even more importantly, you can see which workbooks do not refresh. You get failure reports too. It could well be that a user uploads a workbook and has access to the data source on the desktop, but SharePoint does not have access to the same data sources, and then these workbooks will not refresh, and it is a good idea for IT to look at this. We can also see here the health of my backend systems, where you can see here, for example, what's the CPU on my AS servers. It's running around 12% here, 13% maybe. So I'm not really seeing a CPU bottleneck. What's with the memory? That's usually a higher requirement on a BI server. Now here it's consuming around 5 gigabytes in total. And then there are some more activity reports. Now this is the management dashboard, but you can also extend that management dashboard in itself. Let me show you the architecture. There's this source Power Pivot workbook that drives our management dashboard user interface. And as a Power Pivot workbook, it's available to be consumed by additional solutions. So if you have multiple farms, where each farm has its own management dashboard, it is thinkable that you build a global management dashboard experience where you bring in the data from all these individual source workbooks and show, independent of a SharePoint farm, what the workbook usage is. Another scenario where this data came very handy, for example, within Microsoft, was during the time frame when Microsoft IT migrated from SharePoint 2010 to SharePoint 2013 environments on premises. There was also a question, how many workbooks do we actually have in our content databases that users are actively using? And that's a very useful piece of information when you're migrating. At least it was for us, to see also how important these BI solutions are in the greater context of a SharePoint environment. The dashboard architecture in itself, just for completeness, relies on SharePoint timer jobs and the usage logs within SharePoint. Our components are instrumented in the way that they write into the SharePoint usage logs, but we have our own usage data import timer job that takes from these usage logs what's important for us. It's an extension to the usage data import timer job that already exists within SharePoint, and we write our information into our Power Pivot application database, from where a management dashboard processing timer job moves that data into our source workbook, and then it is available to our reporting workbooks. These are also linked workbooks based on the source workbook. The workbook itself is empty. It has no charts. It only holds the data. The reason why we did this is so that we have it easy to provide localized user interfaces. So we have about 40 languages that we support with Power Pivot. So we have 40 linked workbooks that all use the same data workbook. And in that way, we avoided having 40 times the same data. Yep. Oh, well, I already showed you that. And then we have I mentioned it before, the ACM server, the Audit and Control Management server, that can integrate with SharePoint and that can take full inventory of the components you have in your environments. You can see, for example, what relationships, the quality is not very good, what relationships there are within the workbook. You can see the risky elements, like what hidden cells and hidden formulas are in a workbook. You can categorize spreadsheets. You can perform several, activities that are important for auditing. Whenever you have questions about what SharePoint, what BI solutions your office workers are using there. And this is the scenario that I already mentioned a few times, where we go from self-service BI to corporate BI. This is how we view this world. We have these three different levels. One is the personal BI level, where you have Excel on the desktop with Power Pivot and Power View directly in Excel and Data Explorer. You have no other collaboration environment that you need. You just have your workstation and you go and solve your own problems. That's personal BI for us. Enjoy the analysis of your video collection or whatever other information you gather. Then we have SharePoint. The moment you upload that Power Pivot workbook that you created into SharePoint, you move from personal BI to team BI. And then when the IT department comes in and takes this workbook and transfers this into a tabular model, that's when we enter corporate BI. And that is also, there's another, this is nice that we have this capability to move a BI solution through these stages all the way to the right. There's another important element where self-service BI can help in IT department and BI Pro, and that is, in the past, it was, the standard process of gathering requirements is to go to the business user and get the requirements and document them. In the new world, you don't really need that. If you look at the self-service BI tool that this user perhaps already created, then you hit the ground running, because you can already see in general what that user really wants, what problems he's trying to solve. And in many cases, you now bring a Power user, an Excel hardcore user, into a position where he can contribute more value to the organization. By giving him more capabilities to build BI solutions, if you establish a good relationship between these Power users and your BI pros that actually develop the BI solutions for the corporate world, then you actually bring both sides to the table and create mutual advantages for both. The Power user feels more empowered to build even more solutions that are useful for the team, and the BI pro has a better wire into the business and understands the business needs of the organization better. Faster. Solution delivery, time to market, those are key elements that count too. When you want to have problem solved, you don't want to wait 3 months. You want to have it solved right now, maybe at the end of the weeks, but certainly not later. And those kinds of flows are possible within our stack. Very quickly, you've seen it, it's just a few mouse clicks, you select that workbook and you create a tabular model out of it. In theory, there are always aspects of how the data source is available to the tabular server once you migrate all these things. For example, one of the tools that I showed you today was Data Explorer going to that web table. This technology is not yet available on an analysis services server, so a BI pro would have to do more work to get that data into a table. Yep, and then we are actually good in time for some questions and answers. So to sum this up, self-service BI governance really is about management, change management processes, and the facilitation of BI adoption in the enterprise. It's supposed to help business users become more effective in their use of BI technologies. It's supposed to make work easier, as well as addressing the risks that are involved with self-service BI solutions in a way that doesn't hinder the business users to solve their problems, but enables them actually to go all the way out, while at the same time keeping IT in the driver's seat and maintaining control and oversight over what the business users are doing without being the bad guy always raising a finger and saying, oh, you must not do this and you must not do that. It's a question what should be governed. Too strict, it constrains productivity. Too loose, it's a balance. And yeah, how to implement it, you need to involve both the business side and the IT side in it. You need to establish clear goals, and principles should guide you even in this governance process. You should have a clear understanding who owns what and who has the authority to make decisions, and build your training plan. And then we're through. This is related content that you might find interesting here at TechEd. This is all about the BI track. The SharePoint topics, we had this in the beginning of this presentation, are pretty much around reporting services, Power View, and Power Pivot. Those all relate to the self-service BI scenarios. Yep. Any questions at this point? Yeah?
Is there a plan within the BI stack to have something along the lines of the resource governor there is in the database?
The question is, do we have plans in BI stack to implement resource governor to, for example, have the ability to constrain what resources and analysis services server, for example, uses? We do have plans to implement things like that. But it's still quite a while out.
Are the features to manage, audit, and compare Excel files with SharePoint all out of the box?
No, the question is, are the features for audit and control management, are these out of the box available with SharePoint or with the BI stack? They are not. Audit and control management is a separate server product, but it integrates with SharePoint. It has a front-end component that you need to install within SharePoint, and then this component basically tracks whenever you upload or work with the workbook and updates the ACM database. And then you have the analysis piece to it in the ACM server system too, and they also have their crawlers for file servers and things. Well, then we're through with the content. Thank you very much for your attention.